Picture this. It is late Saturday night, May 16th, 2026. The people of Moscow are asleep in their apartments. The elites in their high-rise towers in the exclusive Patriarchy district are resting comfortably, far away from the war they have been watching on television for the past 4 years. The war that Putin told them was going according to plan. The war that Russian state media kept assuring them was being handled. The war that, until this night, had felt like someone else's problem. And then the sky above Moscow lit up. Not with fireworks, not with celebration, with explosions, with the sound of drones flying low over the rooftops of one of the most heavily defended cities on the planet. A city protected by not one, not two, but according to military analysts, approximately 130 air defense positions arranged into dense rings around the capital, with additional systems deployed inside the city itself. A city that Vladimir Putin had personally fortified more than almost any other location in the entire Russian Federation. A city where the people had been told again and again that they were safe. They were not safe. On the night of May 16th going into May 17th, 2026, Ukraine launched what would become officially confirmed as the largest and most devastating drone attack on Moscow since the full-scale invasion began back in February 2022. Over 1,000 Ukrainian drones were tracked and engaged by Russian air defense systems across more than 14 regions of Russia within a single 24-hour period. Russia's own defense ministry was forced to confirm that their systems intercepted and destroyed 1,054 Ukrainian drones, 8 guided aerial bombs, and 2 newly developed Ukrainian missiles in just one day. Let that number sink in for a moment. Over 1,000 drones. And that is just the number Russia is admitting to. That is the number they are proud of, the number they put in the headline to make it sound like a victory. But here is the real question nobody in Moscow wanted to answer that morning. If you shot down over 1,000 drones, why is the oil refinery on fire? Why are construction workers bleeding near the Kapotnya district? Why are apartment buildings in Khimki, Krasnogorsk, and Istra in flames? Why are the residential towers in the suburbs of your own capital showing scorch marks and shattered windows? The answer is simple and terrifying for the Kremlin. Because enough drones got through. Enough drones penetrated the so-called impenetrable for rings of air defense around Moscow to strike targets that had never been hit before. The Moscow oil refinery, the Angstrom semiconductor plant in Zelenograd, sometimes called Russia's Silicon Valley, 2 major fuel pumping stations at Solnekhnegorsk and Volodarskoye, a patrol boat near Caspian, Dagestan, nearly 1,000 kilometers from the front line, and military installations in occupied Crimea, including a Pantsir S-2 air defense system, radar equipment for an S-400 system, drone control systems, and an air traffic control tower at Belbek airfield. All of this happened in one night. But to truly understand why this moment matters, why this single night changed everything about how the world understands this war, you need to go back just a few days, because this attack did not come out of nowhere. It was a response, a direct, deliberate, and calculated response to something Russia did that crossed a line which Ukraine was not going to let stand without answering. And the answer that Ukraine delivered was so massive, so unprecedented, that even the people who live inside Russia, the people who have been sheltered from the truth by state propaganda for 4 years, could not ignore what was happening above their own heads. So let's start from the beginning. Let's talk about what Russia did first. Let's talk about the 9-story apartment building in Kyiv. Let's talk about the children. And then let's talk about how Ukraine made sure Moscow finally understood what it feels like to live under a war that you started but refused to end. This is the story of the night Moscow turned into hell. And it is a story that begins not in Moscow but in Kyiv days earlier, with a missile that was built just weeks ago and was aimed directly at sleeping civilians. Stay with me, because this story gets more extraordinary with every single detail. Before we talk about what Ukraine did to Moscow, we have to talk about what Russia did to Kyiv, because context matters, because the world needs to understand that Ukraine did not wake up one morning and decide to launch over 1,000 drones at Russia's capital for no reason. There was a reason. and that reason has a name, a location, and a body count that includes children who never made it to adulthood. On the night of May 13th, going into May 14th, 2026, Russia launched what Ukrainian officials described as the largest aerial attack on their country in the entire 4 years of this full-scale war. It was not a sudden attack. It was not improvised. According to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, Russia had deliberately stockpiled drones and missiles over a period of time, carefully timing this strike to ensure it was as massive as possible and as challenging as possible for Ukrainian air defenses to handle. This was a planned massacre. Russia launched a combined assault starting with daytime drone strikes on the afternoon of May 13th, sending at least 800 drones in multiple waves across Ukraine. These hits targeted cities including far western regions of Ukraine that are rarely ever struck, places that Ukrainians thought were relatively safe. The daytime strikes alone killed at least 14 people and injured over 80 others, including children and teenagers. First responders were targeted in what are known as double tap strikes, where a second attack hits the same location after emergency workers arrive, specifically designed to kill the people trying to save lives. And then the night came. After the ceasefire that US President Donald Trump had brokered for May 9th to May 11th, allowing Russia to hold its Victory Day parade in relative quiet, Russia waited just 1 day before resuming full-scale attacks. Then just days later, on the night of May 13th into May 14th, Russia escalated to a level that left the entire world speechless. Russia fired more than 1,560 drones against Ukrainian population centers in a 2-day period. That is the largest aerial bombardment by drone count in a single 2-day stretch since this war began. On top of the drones, 56 missiles were fired overnight. Air raid alarms sounded across Ukraine for approximately 11 hours straight. In Kyiv's Darnitsia neighborhood, a 9-story residential apartment building was hit by a Russian cruise missile. The entire building was destroyed. All 18 apartments were gone. Emergency workers spent more than 24 hours digging through the concrete rubble, pulling out bodies and searching for survivors. When the search and rescue operation was finally concluded, the death toll stood at 24 people. Among the dead were 3 children, a 12-year-old girl, a 15-year-old girl, as confirmed by Mayor Vitaly Klitschko himself, and a third child born in 2013, meaning they were only 12 or 13 years old. These were kids who should have been in school, kids who had their entire lives ahead of them, killed by a missile that, according to Zelensky, had been manufactured in the second quarter of 2026, meaning just weeks before it was fired, built with components that Russia was still importing in violation of international sanctions, still sneaking into the country despite years of Western export controls. 48 people were injured in Kyiv alone. 27 of those injured required hospitalization. Across the rest of Ukraine, cities like Kharkiv, Kremenchuk, Bila Tserkva, Sumy, Odessa, and Zaporizhia all came under fire. A vehicle belonging to United Nations staff delivering humanitarian aid in Kherson was struck twice by Russian drones in 2 separate locations, while clearly marked as a humanitarian convoy. Multiple energy infrastructure targets were hit. A power substation and high-voltage power line in Kyiv were damaged. A train locomotive in the Kharkiv region was struck, though the crew managed to escape. Ukraine's Air Force spokesperson said publicly that Ukraine was experiencing the largest strikes since the start of the full-scale invasion. Air defense forces were under severe strain. Even with an interception rate of over 93%, the sheer volume of incoming weapons meant that enough got through to cause catastrophic destruction. French President Emmanuel Macron called out Russia directly, saying that this attack exposed what he called all the hypocrisy with which Russia had been negotiating a ceasefire. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen condemned the attack as indiscriminate targeting of civilians and announced that the EU was finalizing a €6 billion drone support package for Ukraine. Ukraine initiated an emergency meeting of the UN Security Council, and Zelensky stood in front of the cameras and pointed out something that the entire world needed to hear. The cruise missile that destroyed that apartment building and killed those children had been built just weeks earlier, in 2026, using components that Russia was still importing by circumventing international sanctions. Russia is still building precision weapons. Russia is still getting the microchips and electronics it needs to manufacture the missiles it fires at sleeping civilians. And one of the companies producing those components, one of the facilities making the microelectronics that go into Russian precision weapons, was located just outside Moscow, in a place called Zelenograd. Zelensky said it plainly: stopping Russia's sanctions evasion must be a genuine priority. 2 days later, Ukraine made sure that particular facility stopped producing anything at all. What Ukraine did in response was not improvised. It was not emotional. It was not a panicked retaliation. It was a precisely planned, strategically designed military operation that took careful aim at the very infrastructure keeping Russia's war machine running. And it was executed on a scale that nobody, not even the closest observers of this conflict, had seen Ukraine attempt before. The operation was jointly conducted by Ukraine's armed forces and its security service, known as the SBU. The acting chief of the SBU, Major General Yevgeny Kamara, confirmed publicly that specialized units called Alpha Special Operations drone units were used for the operation. These were not standard drones flying in a straight line hoping to get lucky. These were purpose-built long-range systems specifically designed to bypass layered air defense networks, and they worked. The targets were chosen with a message in mind. Ukraine did not aim for random civilian neighborhoods. Ukraine aimed at the heart of what keeps Russia's military running. Here is what Ukraine officially confirmed striking. First, the Moscow oil refinery in the Kapotnya district of Moscow itself, which according to the information provided earlier in reporting processes approximately 245,000 barrels of oil per day, with around 40% of its output going directly into Moscow's domestic fuel supply. This is one of the most strategically important energy facilities in all of Russia, located inside the capital city, surrounded by air defense systems, considered practically untouchable. Ukraine touched it. 12 people were injured near the refinery checkpoint, most of them construction workers who were on the early morning shift. An explosion occurred. Fires broke out. Second, the Angstrom semiconductor plant in Zelenograd. This is the facility that Zelensky had specifically called out just days earlier when he pointed to the missile that killed 24 people in Kyiv and said it was built using imported components. Angstrom is one of Russia's principal manufacturers of microcontrollers, microprocessors, and discrete transistors. It produces microelectronics for Russia's precision weapons systems, radar equipment, optical systems, and military robotics. It has been under US sanctions since 2022, and yet it was still operating, still producing components that go into the missiles Russia fires at Ukrainian apartment buildings. On the night of May 16th, a Ukrainian drone flew directly into that facility. As the Kyiv Post reported, Ukraine hit Russia's Silicon Valley directly in the center of its war-making capability. Third, the Solnekhnegorskoye loading station in the village of Durakino, approximately 45 kilometers from Moscow. Fires broke out there that could be seen from miles away. Fourth, the Volodarskoye fuel pumping station, another critical node in Moscow's fuel supply network. Fifth, in occupied Crimea, Ukraine struck the Belbek military airfield near Sevastopol. The confirmed targets there included a Pantsir S-2 air defense system, a hangar containing radar equipment for an S-400 air defense system, Orion and four-post drone control systems, a ground-to-air data transmission point, and both an air traffic control tower and a hangar at the airfield itself. In a single night, Ukraine degraded Russian air defense capability in Crimea while simultaneously overwhelming air defense systems around Moscow. Now here is the part that Russian state media does not want its citizens to understand. Moscow is supposed to be the most protected city in Russia. According to military analysis by organizations like Militarny, as of spring 2026, Moscow is defended by approximately 130 air defense positions arranged into dense rings around the capital, with additional systems deployed inside the city itself. Putin had spent enormous resources building what he believed was an impenetrable shield around his capital. He wanted Muscovites to feel safe. He wanted them to believe that the war was somewhere far away in eastern Ukraine, in places they had never visited and could barely find on a map. And yet a woman was killed when her private home in Khimki was struck. Two men were killed in the village of Pogorelki in the Mytishchi district, in the western town of Istra. Four people were injured when drones damaged several residential tower blocks. In Krasnogorsk, residents stood in front of damaged apartment buildings looking at the rubble in disbelief. An Indian construction worker lost his life near the oil refinery, with three of his colleagues injured, something so significant that the Indian embassy in Moscow issued an official statement confirming it and saying embassy officials had visited the location and were working with local authorities. And then there was the phenomenon that nobody in the Kremlin wanted to discuss: Russian air defense systems, overwhelmed by the sheer number of incoming drones and disoriented by GPS jamming that Russia itself had put in place over Moscow years earlier to disrupt Ukrainian drone navigation, began striking residential buildings. Footage emerged, and Russian citizens confirmed with their own eyes that the impacts hitting some apartment buildings were not Ukrainian drones, but were Russian interceptor missiles falling on their own neighborhoods. One Russian woman, filmed on a phone camera by a neighbor, said directly, "They hit basically the building next door, the one across the street. The air defense hit it." This is the chaos that descends on a city when over 1,000 drones are in the air at once. Even the best air defense systems in the world struggle when they are fighting on every side simultaneously. Moscow's for airports faced rolling disruptions. Drone debris fell on the grounds of Sheremetyevo, Russia's largest and busiest airport. Flights were canceled. Departures were delayed. The check-in counters fell silent. Passengers stood in confused crowds while outside the terminal. Smoke rose from the direction of the city's most important energy infrastructure. The commander of Ukraine's unmanned systems forces, Robert Brovdy, also known by his call sign Madyar, published a statement after the operation. In it, he addressed the residents of Patriarchy, one of Moscow's most exclusive and expensive residential districts. The message was clear: the war has reached your doorstep. Not because Ukraine wants to harm Russian civilians, but because Russia's government chose to start this war and has refused every opportunity to end it. Let us talk about what happened inside Russia after this attack, because the response from the Russian government, the Russian media, and the Russian public tells us more about the true state of this war than almost anything else could. The first thing Russian state television did was exactly what Russian state television always does. It lied. Russian state media told its viewers that air defense had repelled a large-scale Ukrainian drone attack, that the capital was safe, that the systems had performed. Moscow Mayor Sergei Sobyanin appeared on official channels confirming that over 120 drones had been intercepted near Moscow. He mentioned injuries near the refinery and 3 damaged residential buildings, trying to make it sound minor, manageable, routine. The official line was, "We handled it." But here is the problem for the Kremlin. Moscow is one of the most photographed and filmed cities in the world, and unlike the front lines in eastern Ukraine where Russian authorities can control information flow with some degree of success, Moscow is full of civilians with smartphones who looked out their windows and saw things that did not match what the television was telling them. They saw fires, they saw explosions, they saw drones flying over their neighborhoods with nobody seemingly able to stop them. And in the initial shock and confusion, before the government could reinforce the message that filming drone attacks is technically illegal and punishable by fines, hundreds of videos were posted online. A 39-year-old man named Konstantin, living in the Moscow suburb of Putikovo, spoke to AFP news agency while standing outside his damaged high-rise building. He said the hit was so powerful it almost knocked him out of bed. He opened his window and saw smoke rising. Another resident described hearing a buzzing sound they had never heard before, something flying directly over their house, followed by explosions. Someone else described waking up at 4 in the morning, seeing smoke rising from nearby woods, lying under their blanket fully dressed and shaking, unable to calm their nerves until daylight came. These are the voices of people who live in Moscow. These are the experiences of Russian citizens who had been told for 4 years that this war was going fine, that Ukraine was weak, that victory was inevitable, and now they are lying under blankets at 4 in the morning, shaking, watching smoke rise over their city. The psychological impact of this attack on Russia's domestic situation cannot be overstated. Analysts quoted by outlets including the Associated Press and Time magazine pointed out that this attack, more than almost any other development in the war, brings the conflict home to ordinary Russians in a way that is, in their exact words, most unwelcome to the Kremlin. For the first time, a serious independent poll is showing that Russians are more worried about strikes at home than about what is happening at the front line. Even more telling is what happened inside the Russian war blogger community. These are not journalists. These are not opposition figures. These are hardcore supporters of Putin's invasion, people who have cheered every Russian advance and defended every Russian atrocity for 4 years, and even they could not keep up the performance. After May 17th, one of Russia's most followed war bloggers, Romanov, posted a statement dripping with sarcasm aimed directly at Kremlin propaganda. He described how a major southern Russian chemical facility, one of the largest industrial enterprises in the region, had clearly been struck by Ukrainian drones based on footage that any Russian could see, fires visible from tens of miles away, and the regional governor had issued an official statement claiming there was no damage. Romanov told his followers, sarcastically, that if what they see with their own eyes contradicts official sources, they should not believe their eyes. Trust the official sources. He was not telling people to trust the official sources. He was telling them those sources are a joke. This is the moment when you know a propaganda system is starting to crack, when the people who have been its most enthusiastic defenders start publicly mocking it. And then came the signal that perhaps shocked people even more than the attack itself. On May 17th, the same day the smoke was still rising over Moscow, Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov made a public statement saying that the Kremlin is interested in restoring dialogue with Ukraine. This was a direct statement from Putin's own spokesperson. The man who speaks for the Russian government was talking about wanting dialogue with the country whose capital Russia had been bombing for 4 years, just hours after that country sent over 1,000 drones into Russian airspace. The connection between these two events was impossible to miss for anyone paying attention. Russia had been told for years by its own government that Ukraine was losing, that Ukraine was desperate, that Ukraine was begging for peace. And now, the morning after Ukraine demonstrated it could penetrate Moscow's air defenses and strike, the Russian capital's oil refinery and semiconductor plants, suddenly Peskov is talking about wanting dialogue. The Kremlin does not want the Russian public to draw the obvious conclusion, but the Russian public is not blind. They can see the fires, they can hear the drones, and they can see their own spokesperson quietly signaling that something has shifted. Russian news channels were playing defense in a way they had never had to play before. They could claim they shot down 1,000 drones. They could show footage of intercepted explosions in the sky. What they could not explain away were the fires burning at the Moscow oil refinery, the dead and injured, the cracked windows and burning. Homes in Moscow's northern suburbs, the Angstrom-plant in Leningrad standing damaged, a facility that was supposed to be safely deep inside Russia, protected by every layer of air defense the Russian military could muster. The propaganda wall did not collapse on May 17th, but it cracked. And for a government that runs entirely on the narrative of strength, on the story that it is always winning, even a crack is significant. Let us zoom out for a moment. Let us look at what this single operation, this single night in May 2026, actually means for the broader trajectory of this war, because the significance of what happened goes far beyond the fires at one refinery and the damage to one semiconductor plant. What happened on May 17, 2026, is a turning point in how this war is being fought and who holds the strategic initiative. For the first 4 years of this conflict, Russia operated under a fundamental assumption that shaped everything about its military strategy. That assumption was, Russia can hit Ukraine, but Ukraine cannot meaningfully hit Russia back. Russia could fire missiles at Kyiv's apartment buildings, knowing that the people of Moscow would sleep safely. Russia could launch drone swarms at Ukrainian cities, knowing that the cities of Russia, especially the capital, were effectively unreachable. This asymmetry was not just a military reality. It was the psychological foundation of the entire war. It was the reason ordinary Russians could support the invasion without feeling its consequences personally. It was the reason Putin could promise victory without anyone asking what happens if Ukraine decides to bring the fight to Moscow. That assumption is now gone. Ukraine has demonstrated, with over 1,000 drones in the air simultaneously, with strikes confirmed on targets more than 310 miles from the Ukrainian border, with attacks penetrating two dense rings of air defense containing approximately 130 defensive positions, that Russia's capital is no longer a sanctuary. This is not theoretical. This is not a warning. This happened. The fires were real. The dead were real. The shaking residents lying under their blankets at 4 in the morning were real. And Ukraine did this with domestically built weapons. This is a point that Zelensky emphasized explicitly. He said Ukraine's long-range capabilities, produced inside Ukraine, reached the Moscow region despite what he described as the highest concentration of Russian air defense systems anywhere on Earth. Ukraine does not need permission from Washington or Brussels to strike inside Russia. Ukraine does not need to wait for foreign weapons to arrive. Ukraine has built its own long-range drone fleet capable of operations at this scale, and it has demonstrated that capability in the most dramatic way possible. The strategic implications are enormous. Consider what Ukraine struck. It did not just strike symbolic targets to make a point. It struck the Angstrom semiconductor plant, a facility producing the microchips that go into Russian precision missiles. The missiles that killed 24 people in Kyiv, including 3 children, were built using components made by facilities like Angstrom. By striking that plant, Ukraine is not just sending a message. Ukraine is degrading Russia's ability to build the next round of weapons. It is attacking the supply chain of the very weapons being used against Ukrainian civilians. This is not revenge. This is strategy. It struck Moscow's oil refinery, which processes a massive amount of fuel and supplies a significant portion of the capital's domestic energy needs. It struck 2 fuel pumping stations in the Moscow region. Ukraine's stated goal in targeting Russian energy infrastructure has been consistent: to reduce Russia's revenue from oil exports, which fund the war, and to strain the domestic economy that supports the public's tolerance for continued conflict. Every refinery hit, every fuel depot set on fire, every pipeline disrupted moves Russia closer to an economic reality that makes continuing this war more costly. And it struck Crimea. While Moscow was dealing with fires at home, Ukraine was simultaneously degrading air defense systems in occupied Crimea, hitting an S-400 radar installation, a Pantsir missile system, drone control systems, and military airfield infrastructure. This was a multi-front, multi-domain operation conducted simultaneously, showing a level of military coordination that would have been impossible for Ukraine to execute even 2 years ago. What does Russia do next? That is the question every analyst is trying to answer. The hardline option is for Putin to escalate further, to launch even more massive attacks on Ukraine in retaliation for this retaliation for his retaliation. But there is a problem with that approach. Russia has already been escalating. The May 13th to 15th attack was already described as the largest in the war's history. Russia fired 1,560 drones in 2 days. It destroyed an apartment building. It killed children. And Ukraine's response was not to surrender or to beg for negotiations. Ukraine's response was to send more drones back in the other direction, at greater range, with greater precision, against more strategic targets than ever before. There is also the matter of what this does to Russia's home front. Putin's ability to maintain domestic support for this war depends partly on the Russian public not feeling its costs personally. When the war was only something happening to Ukrainians, Russians could ignore it, support it abstractly, believe the television when it told them it was going well. Now people in Moscow are filming drones flying over their apartment buildings. Now residents of Khimki are mourning a neighbor killed in her own home. Now construction workers near the oil refinery are recovering from blast injuries in Moscow hospitals. Now an Indian worker is dead near the Kapotnya refinery, creating an international incident that even friendly countries cannot simply overlook. The Kremlin spokesperson talking about wanting dialogue the morning after this attack is not a coincidence. It may not be sincere. It may be a calculated public relations move designed to signal openness without actually committing to anything. But the fact that this signal was sent at all on that specific morning tells you everything you need to know about how the attack landed internally. Zelensky's message was simple, and he delivered it in writing for the whole world to read. Our responses to Russia's prolongation of the war and its attacks on our cities and communities are entirely justified. This time, Ukrainian long-range capabilities reached the Moscow region. We are clearly telling the Russians their state must end its war. The commander of Ukraine's unmanned forces put a message on the wing of a drone that was headed into Russian territory. That message read, "A one-sided subscription to a peaceful life is cancelled." For 4 years, Ukrainians have lived with the sound of explosions in the night. They have buried their children. They have stood at the ruins of apartment buildings and searched the rubble for people they loved. They have done all of this while the residents of Moscow slept, while Russian elites went about their comfortable lives, while Kremlin officials gave press conferences talking about how the special military operation was proceeding according to plan. On the night of May 16th going into May 17th, 2026, that subscription expired. The war that Russia started in Ukraine has come home to Russia. It has come home to Moscow. It has come home to the very people who chose to look away while their government murdered civilians for 4 years. And the message that Ukraine is sending is not complicated. It is not subtle. It does not require translation. End the war, or we will keep coming back. And based on what happened over Moscow skies on that night in May, Ukraine has every ability to make good on that promise.